Now the reason I mention all of that is because I'm convinced that God is constantly trying to talk to us. And He's constantly giving us opportunities to walk on water. It might not be a physical lake like this, a sea. But in everyday life, I'm convinced that God is giving us opportunities. Let me share one opportunity that came by me a number of years ago. And then I'd like to take another text and share one more story after that. We don't have anything else to do. But a number of years ago, and some of you maybe have heard me talk about this story of a young girl by the name of Tabitha. Anybody remember the story of Tabitha? How many of you have never heard about Tabitha? Quite a few of you? How many of you are awake? Emily and I used to live in Ohio, Dayton, Ohio. And a story came across on the news that a young girl, 13 years old, by the name of Tabitha, was arrested. Tabitha had murdered another 13-year-old girl in her neighborhood. What had happened was this young 13-year-old girl, Tabitha, was being teased by a friend in the neighborhood. She was tired of it. This girl was taking like a brick and she kept hitting her on the head and chasing her, and Tabitha was tired of it. She went to her older brother and she said that, what do I do? How do I get her to stop this? And her older brother said, here's what you do. Next time she does that, go inside and get one of Mom's steak knives. And when you come out, act like you're going to stab her, but don't do it really, but just kind of boom, to her right, like her arm, and just barely tap her, and she's going to be so freaked out she'll never bother you again. Well, it happened. The girl was teasing Tabitha, and Tabitha ran inside. She got Mom's steak knife. She came back out and told the girl to stop it, and went at her like that, and the girl moved, and the knife hit her jugular. Blood began to shoot out. The girl was screaming, started running, and about 2 blocks later fell over dead. And there was Tabitha, shaking, frightened. The police came. Tabitha was arrested. Everybody in Dayton, Ohio knew this story. It was on the news constantly. 13-year-old Tabitha, reigned and all of this. And we all knew about it. We talked about it at the cooler. We talked about it at restaurants. We saw it on the news. Tabitha, arrested and being tried for murder at 13 years old. Well, so often we hear about these stories, but we think about, the fact that I can't do anything about it. I'm just me, and I can't do anything about it anyway. Well, one day I was driving from our church, and I was on my way to do something really important that day. I was going to get a Dairy Queen. I deserved it. I had worked very hard for weeks. I really did. I deserved a dip cone, dipped in chocolate. And I was looking forward to it, and I was driving down the road, and I had the radio on, and suddenly the story came on the radio that this young 13-year-old Tabitha was sentenced and was going to be sent to a women's prison at 13, the special section of this women's prison. And I was sitting there thinking about her, and I pulled over to the side of the road, and I started thinking about Tabitha. Never met her before or anything. And I asked one question, and that was, what would Jesus do? Lord, what would you do if you were here about Tabitha? You've seen these bracelets before, WWJD, what would Jeff do? Have you seen those? Well, I started asking, well, what would Jesus do? What would he do if you were here? And here's what happened. I just had this little voice inside. Remember Mount Carmel, 1 Kings 19? You ever get to Mount Carmel, meditate on that? Still small voice of God. And I heard this little voice inside, just this thought, that if I were there, I would go to the prison, and I'd wrap my arms around her and tell her, Tabitha, I love you, and I haven't forgotten about you. And I sat and thought about that. And then I thought, if that's what the Lord would do, and I'm the body of Christ. These are his arms, his legs, his eyes, his heart. If that's what Jesus would do, then that's what I will do. And so I turned the car around and I headed towards downtown Dayton. I had never been to the jail before, ever, but I knew that she was down there according to the news report. So it took me about 10 minutes. I was on my way to go to the Dairy Queen. I turned around, went to downtown Dayton, found the jail within 10-15 minutes. I parked, went up these steps, and walked in the front door. There was plexiglass or bulletproof glass there with like a reception. And I walked over and I said to the guy who was leaning down writing, I said, "Excuse me, I said, this is 10 minutes after I'm supposed to be having a Dairy Queen. This is what Christianity is all about." And I said, "Excuse me, I'm here to see Tabitha so-and-so." And he didn't even look up at me. He just kept writing. He said, "Well, I'm sorry, but nobody's allowed to." And he said, "What was your name?" So I said my name. I said, "It's Jeff Cavins." He said, "Did you just give a Cursillo retreat for women?" I said, "I did. My wife went to that. And her whole life has changed. She's like, Jesus this, Jesus that, blah, 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 blah." And he puts out a piece of paper. He said, "Here, sign right here." This is 15 minutes after Dairy Queen, where all of a sudden I'm signing to walk into a prison, to a jail. And he got up and he walked around and he opened the door and brought me in. And he said, "Come with me." And he brought me into back end of this jail, set me in a cell, closed the door, and said, "We'll be back in just a few minutes." And I'm sitting there thinking, this is 20 minutes after I'm supposed to be enjoying my dip cone. I'm in jail. I am sitting in a jail right now. Why? Simply because I said, okay. It's like the Lord is saying, "Come." And I said, "All right." I don't know how to get into jails. Well, I do, but I've never done that stuff. But I don't know how to get in there legally. I don't know anything about that. All I know is I thought, if the Lord said to do this, then I'm going to do it. So there I am sitting in jail. A few minutes later, the cell opens up, and a guard brings this little, tiny, little girl into the cell. And her hair is over her head, and she's shaking like a leaf. Turns out she thought I was the one there to bring her to the prison. She had a piece of paper in her hand. And I'll never forget the story. It's so vivid in my thinking. The guard stepped back, and there I was, face to face with this little girl who we'd all been talking about in the news. And everyone's speaking about the family, and of course they should, the victim's family. But the Lord seemed to want to do something to this young girl. And I looked at her, and she looked at me, and I said, "Tabitha?" And she kind of looked at me, and I told her, "My name is Jeff Cavins." And I told her what happened. I was driving down the road, and I asked what Jesus would do. And I walked over to little Tabitha. I walked over to her. She was just like a leaf shaking. And I put my arm around her, and I brought her to myself, and I whispered into her ear. I said, "Tabitha," I said, "I love you, and I haven't forgotten about you. Jesus." And she started sobbing. She started sobbing, and she held out this piece of paper to me. And I'll never forget it. I opened it up. It was a Christian tract that she found on her cell. And the tract was a tract about how God loves her so much and has not forgotten her. And initially, she wondered whether I was Jesus, coming to tell her that. And I looked at her and I said, "Tabitha, has anyone been here to visit you?" And I'll never forget it. She said, "No one." She actually didn't say no one. The guard did. The guard took a step up and he went. Came from a rough family. And that day, my life changed. As I realized that going about my regular everyday business, God could do something with me, a nobody, to change somebody else's life. And from that point on, we set some people to be pen pals with Tabitha. We've lost touch with Tabitha. We're not sure where she is anymore, but she did serve her time. And we had a couple of girls in the church that ended up becoming pen pals with Tabitha. Now, I share that story with you because that is a story that really happened with someone who didn't think that God would do that type of thing today in their life. I want to challenge you this evening. What is God calling you to? And how will you know if it's God unless you get out of the boat? You'll never be able to know for sure if what God is speaking to your heart is really what he wants you to do, or if it was just a thought that you had. Speaking of the thoughts that we have, I wanted to turn our attention to one more story, and that is Acts chapter 8. Many of us are familiar with the story in Acts chapter 8. It's a story of Philip. And Philip is walking, and there's a man going by in a chariot. Remember the story, the Ethiopian eunuch? He's going by and he's reading an Isaiah scroll. He's reading a scroll, and he is in charge of the harem for Candace, Queen of Ethiopia. And he's just about his everyday business. And the scriptures tell us, it's very, very beautiful how it says it. It says in Acts chapter 8, "But an angel of the Lord said to Philip," verse 26, "Rise and go toward the south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a desert road." And he rose and went. And behold, an Ethiopian, a eunuch, a minister of Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of all her treasure, had come to Jerusalem to worship, and was returning, seated in his chariot. He was reading the prophet Isaiah. And the Spirit said to Philip, "Go up and join this chariot." So Philip ran to him and heard him reading Isaiah the prophet, and asked, "Do you understand what you are reading?" And he said, "How can I unless someone guides me?" And he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. And then they tell us the passage, and you know the story. He ends up being baptized, the Ethiopian. But the thing that I wanted to point out to you is this, is that suddenly in the midst of this, in verse 29, the Spirit said to Philip, "Go up and join this chariot." And Philip ran to him and heard him reading Isaiah. Now, do you get the sequence of events there? The Spirit of the Lord spoke to Philip, and what did the Spirit of the Lord say? Go up to that chariot. So what did Philip do? He starts running. He starts running up to the chariot and says, "Hey, do you know what you're reading there?" "No, how could I?" "Come on up." That's how the story goes. All right? Now, here's what's interesting, is those words, "and the Spirit said to Philip." I want to bring up a topic that most of us have never heard homilies on or much or talks about, and that is this: hearing the voice of God. This is one of those subjects where when we read the Bible, we do a great disservice to ourselves. We read the Bible in such a way that we could never, ever do that. Right? That's Philip did that. Abraham heard God. David heard God. Moses heard God. Noah, everyone heard God, but I'm just me. And then the Spirit spoke to Philip, and Philip ran up to the chariot. Before I get to the conclusion of that story, I want to tell you a real story that happened in my life about hearing the voice of God. Because how else are you to hear the voice of God than a thought? One evening, Emily and I were getting ready to watch the news. We have kind of a little thing where we love to sit and watch the news in the evening, and talk to each other, maybe make some popcorn. And about 10 to 10, we were getting ready to watch Channel 4 in Minneapolis, Don Shelby. And we were sitting there, and all of a sudden I got this thought that I need to go up to adoration. So my first thought was, yeah, I do sometime. I should. I should. I'm just thinking about adoration. Maybe this week I could go to adoration or whatever. And I dismissed it. And then a few minutes later, the same thought came to mind. Go up to adoration. I thought, well, yeah, I will. And then a third time, this thought came. And I said to Emily, I keep having this thought that I should go to adoration. And she said, well, if the Lord's speaking to you, you need to do it. I said, but I don't want to. I want to watch the news. And I want some popcorn. It's like years earlier, I wanted my dip cone. And she said, well, you should just do it. I said, well, okay. So I got my shoes on, got the car, about 6 minutes up to the church. I drove up to the church. There's only 2 cars in the parking lot. I walked in the front door. The second I walked in the front door, Deacon Otto Sherman from the church that I'm a member of, St. Vincent de Paul, was standing there with a young man about 30 years old. The moment I walked through the door, Deacon Sherman turns around and says, well, that's him right now. That's Jeff. Now what had happened was this young man had left the Catholic Church when he was younger. He came over from Russia and he had left the church. And he was that night seeking out some answers and saw this Catholic church and wondered if there was any literature there about the church or if there's anyone to ask some questions of. So he was there talking to this deacon, and the deacon was talking to him for quite a while, and then suddenly the deacon said to him, well, there's this guy in our church that wrote a book. He left the Catholic Church, and then he wrote a book because he came back to the Catholic Church. Well, that's him right now. That's Jeff. That's exactly how the story happened. Now, I have to conclude that the Lord was speaking to me to go up. I ended up spending that evening in prayer with this man called Paul. We prayed. We went out to my car. I had an extra book of mine, My Life on the Rock. I gave it to him. We became friends. About 3 years ago, Paul was sitting in this boat with Danny, on this boat, and worshiping with us. He had come back to the church. He had gone through catechetical instruction. He now teaches the RCIA program and went through the Catechetical Institute. One night, one thought, whether you're going to get out of the boat or not. I could have sat there and watched the news that evening and gone to adoration the next following Tuesday or Wednesday. But I would have missed a great opportunity. Now, I believe God is speaking to us all the time. I really do. I think He's leading and guiding us, but we're not accustomed to following Him that way. But, you know, the story, like Philip there, we read the stories in a way that it could never happen to us. Now, I told you about Paul, right? And when I went up to adoration. Let me tell you the story again and see if you can do this. The man of God was reclining in the evening with his spouse, when suddenly the Spirit of God spoke unto him and said, go up to my house, to my very presence, and worship me. And the man of God said, no, I have other things to do. And the Lord spoke to him not once, not twice, but thrice. Go up to my house. Finally, at the bidding of the man's spouse, the man of God went to the church, and upon arriving saw a poor sinner on his way to hell. Whereupon the man of God spoke to him the truth, and he was converted and became an evangelist. Now, how many of you could do that one? I couldn't do that one. But all I did was had a thought to go up to the church, and my wife said, well, you better do it. And that's our Bible story. And that's what happened here. The Spirit spoke to Philip, and what does it say? Not that there was a booming lightning stream in the sky, or that the earth shook, you know, go up and talk to the man in the chariot. Just the Spirit spoke to Philip, go up to the chariot. So what did Philip do? He started running. He got I imagine, a thought. And so often we dismiss the thoughts when that's what the Lord is calling us to. For Peter, he saw the Lord, they heard his voice, no doubt. But for us, maybe we don't hear that physical voice. Maybe you do. If you do a lot, there's medication. But some of us might hear the voice of the Lord physically, but oftentimes it's just in the heart. It's just in the heart, where we hear the still small voice from 1 Kings 19 on Mount Carmel. Go and love that person. Give the money to them. Go and help them with their groceries. Give their father a call. Buy them this. Whatever it might be. Start a ministry for people who have had an abortion. Do this or that. And you think, I got all these ideas. Well, have you ever acted on them? That's what I believe the Lord does to us on pilgrimages, is He begins to finely tune His voice. And I've been calling you to this. I've been calling you to follow me around, just like the disciples followed the Lord around these shores of the Sea of Galilee. And we don't want to leave here and say, I saw Israel, which is a great thing to do, but we want to leave here saying, I followed the Lord around the Sea of Galilee just like they did. And I really believe the Lord is calling me to follow Him in this way or that way. But you'll never know until you take a step out of the boat.